Okay, hello everyone. My name is Atta Gebril. I work for the American University in Cairo, and since I have only 10 minutes, I'll start right away talking about my topic. As you see on the slide, the title of my talk is Learning-Oriented Test Preparation. And let me give you an outline of the issues I'll be discussing today. I'll start with an introduction in which I'll try to talk about test prep from the perspective of learning-oriented assessment, and then I'll move on to talk about a framework I'm proposing for addressing such issues, and I'll end up with a list of guidelines and recommendations for teachers. Okay, so the introduction, I'll start with this quotation from Green. And Green actually looks at the test preparation as a dark art as perceived by test developers. And actually, there is some merit for this bold statement. Students and teachers alike are usually involved in inappropriate and sometimes unethical test prep activities, especially in high stakes settings where test scores could affect the future lives of examinees. And he linked the discussion to the concept of construct irrelevant variance and test score pollution. Usually when we have gains in test scores that are not reflective of real improvement in language ability, here we can have some issues with test score use and interpretation. Okay, so let me now start talking about the framework. I actually depended on Carless's principles of learning-oriented assessment. Carless and his colleagues actually introduced three principles. The first one has to do with task authenticity. The second one has to do with learner engagement in assessing their own performance. And the third one has to do with the concept of timely improvement-oriented feedback. I'll start with the first one, which is basically task authenticity. As discussed earlier, what we try to do when it comes to authenticity, we want to make sure that the assessment activities are reflective of the target language use domain. So when you have any changes, revisions, or even developing a new assessment tool, we want to make sure that this principle is taken into consideration. Sabel talked about this idea from the perspective of theory of action. So when we have a policy intervention that includes revisions or changes to a current assessment system, want to make sure that these changes will result in improvement in instructional/assessment practices. One of the studies that I really like is a study that was conducted by Diane Wall and Horak in 2011, looking into test prep materials in TOEFL IBT. As you know, TOEFL IBT moved to a completely integrated approach to language assessment, and they were interested in investigating whether test prep sessions actually reflected the changes in the content and of the test and the approach to language assessment within this framework. They found more focus on skills such as discourse synthesis and how to integrate skills. They found also a shift in teaching grammar from focus on grammatical rules to more focus on need-based teaching of grammar. Okay, so that's for task authenticity. The second part I want to talk about, which is basically learner engagement in assessing their own performance. Usually, I mean, as Turner and Purpura indicated, learners should have or should understand two things: learning expectations and assessment criteria. And this is very important basically because that can help them enhance autonomy and self-regulation. Two activities that I find extremely helpful and critical in this setting, and also it was recommended by a number of researchers: peer feedback and self-assessment. I actually picked one example given by Baker and her colleague in a book chapter that just came out. Baker actually gave a peer assessment task to students. So they asked them to give comments on writing samples. And so at the beginning, they shared the assessment criteria and they walked them through how to do it. The fascinating part in this study has to do with the reflections of the students and how they benefited. Number one, they were able to identify their own mistakes and problems and weaknesses based on giving comments to their colleagues. The second part, they were able to link the scoring criteria to their own performance. And more importantly, and this is very important in test prep sessions, the fact that they were able to know what it takes to move from their current level to the next higher level. And this is what we try to do in test prep sessions. We're trying actually to help students improve their scores by moving to the next level. The third one would be on feedback. And I adopted a framework that was proposed by Lebnevich and her colleagues that has four areas: feedback, student or learner characteristics, the third one, response to feedback, and the fourth one, action. And if we look at the first one on the left, it focuses on the nature of feedback. So students need to appreciate the value of feedback. They need to feel that they're involved in a worthwhile activity. And that's why the central issue in this part has to do with, you know, how feedback communicates the degree of success in achieving learning outcomes. Another area that looking at what we have on the slide has to do with the time of feedback. Remember, in test prep sessions, feedback that I would give a month before the exam would be relatively different from the feedback I would give in terms of level details and depth and etc. On other areas, feedback focus, for example, a week before the exam or a day before the exam. Other aspects that they talked about, and which is very important, is the feedback. And remember, those students who come to test prep sessions, they're really anxious, they're stressed out. So you want to make sure that you're not really adding to or contributing to raising their affective filter. Other areas that they proposed is accuracy of feedback. You need to make sure that the feedback is accurate. That's for the first one. The second one, which has to do with the student. I mean, we need to make sure that we understand the ability level of the students. The feedback that we're giving to us students at a certain proficiency level would be relatively different from feedback given to students at a higher level. So if you have a test prep session, you need to understand where students are currently at and the type of the possibilities that they have in terms of where they can move based on your knowledge of their ability, and also the type of expectations of feedback, what type of feedback they're expecting. Then the third area, which is basically response to feedback. Two areas that of interest in that framework when it comes to response to feedback. The first one is the affective response to feedback or the emotional response, and the other one, the cognitive depth of processing that feedback. Emotional response, we need to understand that students, usually receive feedback with this sense sometimes of anger and anxiety, sadness. So we need to understand what they're going through in test prep sessions, especially if they don't see improvement in their own performance. Final part is action, or what is called in the literature uptake. Students have different coping strategies for working on feedback, the type of revisions they will be making. We need to make sure that it's not only about knowing how to answer a specific question, but it's more like how they can develop as learners. These are the four areas of the framework, or the four features of the framework. One final part that I want to talk about is what kind of guidelines or recommendations we can have for practitioners. Number one, we need to make sure that the students have, or teachers, sorry, have adequate assessment literacy. Another area that I want to talk about has to do with expectations or shared interpretations of what we're doing as part of test prep sessions. We need to understand that people tend to have different interpretations of the ability we're targeting or the construct we're targeting. So we need to make sure that we bring stakeholders together to understand what's going on. These are some guidelines and recommendations for learning-oriented test preparation. I hope you found this useful. I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much for listening.